Okay. So, I've been listening to the Bible a lot on my Bible app, and I would highly recommend it. And if you're reading your Bible, just that Romans 10:17 has really hit me. Faith comes from hearing the word. And so now when I have my Bible open, I actually read it aloud. I'll go find a quiet place, and I'll read it so that I hear myself reading it. And it's made a big difference, because what it does for me is it silences my subconscious while I'm hearing myself. And then the Bible app, listening to it, has been brilliant. I started on 1st and 2nd Samuel, then 1st and 2nd Kings, then went to 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And that was really amazing. I was actually telling my parents, because I'm working away renovating a house kind of on my spare time. And so I'm doing kind of a mindless plastering. And if you saw my plastering, you'd realize that it's mindless. And so I'm just going about it. So in the morning, I would start by hearing Solomon building the temple and loading it full of golden bowls and the incense and the cedars of Lebanon that he was using, and just this, all the countries coming to see the organization and all the articles that he had built, and the Ark of the Covenant and the curtains and everything. And then by the afternoon, as I'm listening along, I'm listening to King Nebuchadnezzar Babylon come in and burn the temple and empty all of the same list of things that I heard Solomon putting into the temple. I'm listening to Babylon taking them out. And my heart just went out to God. God, you wanted to invest, but because of the disobedience of Israel in that history, you had to rebuke and you had to discipline. I started thinking of my life, and there's a band called Need to Breathe, and they have a song called Difference Maker, and there's a line in there that says, "Isn't it amazing how a man can I won't be able to quote it exactly, but God will give him something and he'll build it and he'll tear it down with his own hands." It's just amazing. So so I'm just getting lost in these stories. Well, I have a message tonight. I'm going to tell the story of 3 different kings. And this message is for somebody that doesn't like where they're at right now. This message is for somebody who feels that they were born for more, but feel that you don't have the resources or even the people around you to get there. You feel like you were born for a greater purpose, but here you are just where you're at. For some of you, this message is for people that you feel God has told you something, has promised you something, but somehow he's faded to black, and so is the promise. I'm going to tell you the story of 3 different kings. The first starts before he was a king, David. There was a king on the throne, Saul, and he was God's first choice as king. But then Saul started to go crazy. That was actually had demons coming into him. He was consulting witches. This is the king of Israel, consulting witches to find out whether he should go to war or not. He was improperly sacrificing things to God in a way that he said you shouldn't do. So God ends up, after time of Saul making stupid decisions, God rejects him as king. And Samuel the prophet God says, Samuel starts to mourn that Saul's been rejected as king. And God says, "Don't worry, Samuel, I found a man who's after my own heart. I found a man." That's our introduction to David. God finds him. So Samuel goes to David's father's house. Jesse is his name. And Jesse parades. He says, "I've come here to anoint one of your boys is supposed to be the next king of Israel. So Jesse parades, he had 8 boys, parades the older 7. David was number 8, the youngest. Parades 7 boys in front of him. And God kept going, nope, nope, nope. That's where that brilliant line in there, because some of them were big strapping guys, and that's where God goes, Samuel, don't look to the outward appearance. Man looks to the outward appearance, but I look to the heart. I love that line. And so Samuel, after that, says to Jesse, do you have no other boys? And Jesse, as an afterthought, goes, well, I do have the younger one out in the fields shepherding the sheep. Samuel says, go and get him. And he also kind of rebukes Jesse. He says, we will not sit down until he arrives. So in comes David. Right away, God says, that's the man I found. That's him. So Samuel, in front of David's brothers and father, who essentially had written him off for whatever reason, anoints David, the youngest brother, the next king of Israel. Well, time goes on. Samuel goes on his way. Saul is still king at this point. And he keeps doing stupid things. The demons start to bother Saul, so he calls, he says, do you know anybody who can play an instrument so that when the demons start to bother me, they can play that instrument and then I'll calm down, calm the spirits down. So they said, well, David plays an instrument. So David's in the king's court. Now remember, he was anointed to be the king. And now he's playing a harp for the king every time the demons get the best of him to calm him down. Well, I don't know if you've seen or you can imagine somebody who's being bothered by demons. They're frantic. They're not listening to the music. And I'm sure it was chaotic at some point. Saul at one point throws a spear at David. And David's just, as an expert musician, just playing his harp all the way through the chaos until finally Saul's calmed down and probably just falls asleep. David is in this humbling position, knowing that he was anointed to be king, and yet he's trying to calm down this crazy king. Later, he knows Saul wants to kill him. And so he ends up running off and going in, hiding in the caves. And Saul, with his army, starts to chase him. Saul was jealous of David, especially after David went and killed Goliath. All the ladies started coming out into the streets and singing, oh, Saul's killed his thousands, but David was a big strapping young man. David's killed his tens of thousands. Saul just got jealous. So David leaves the kingdom. He's running. He was anointed to be king. He was anointed to be king when he was, I wrote these numbers down because I knew I wouldn't remember them. When it just said he was young. He was young, so I'm going to say he was 13, 14. He was delivering sandwiches to his brothers when he ended up calling on Goliath. He was delivering sandwiches. That's after Samuel came and anointed him king in front of the brothers. I'm sure the brothers are going, oh yeah, some king you are. Probably wrote Samuel off and wrote off the whole prophecy. But David did everything, shepherding, delivering the lunch. He never complained. He never threw the fact that he was going to be king in anyone's face. He never slapped God by saying, what's going on here? You anointed me to be king, and I'm being mistreated by my dad, by my brothers, by my king. David's out running. When he was running away from Saul, people started following him. He actually put an army together of mighty men, because David was a fighter. We see it with Goliath. He tells Saul before he goes at Goliath, when a lion came out to try to get my sheep, I killed him with my bare hands. Then a bear came out, I killed him with my bare hands. David was a fighter. He started, all these other fighting men, and it's called David's fighting men, start coming around. He starts ransacking Philistine villages and destroying their armies. Finally, Saul gets into trouble with an army, and he dies. David was 30 years old when Saul passed away and he finally became king. I'm going to say anywhere from 15 to 20 years he waited after being anointed to be king, and he never once failed on the promise, and everything that he did before becoming king, he did with expertise. So we can infer in the text, what was God doing? Well, it's not like Saul was in the way. But when David was anointed king, I don't think Israel was ready to have a teenager as king. And there were still some looking at Saul. And I don't think David was ready. He was leading sheep, but he wasn't leading people till he was out there running from Saul. So he's getting his leadership training. He's getting his battle training. Meanwhile, Saul is doing stupid things, and Israel's getting more and more frustrated with him. And you can just see the whole equilibrium changing. And in God's wisdom, about 15 years later, after the anointing, David becomes king. Well, David was king for 40 years. What has God told you? Do you feel like God has left you? He's anointed you, and then he kind of fades to black? You can take an example from David. He could have so many times just said, I'm done, I'm done, I'm done. I'm never going to be king. But instead, without even knowing it, he acted like a king. People started following him because he was anointed. Here's the other amazing thing about David. I already mentioned that he did everything with excellence. He never complained. And everything he found, as Ecclesiastes says, everything he finds his hands to do, he did it well. But here's the other amazing thing. Before there was even a promise to be king or have a kingdom, before God ever anointed David, he was out in the fields worshiping God like a madman, all by himself. Are you waiting to worship God because you don't feel he's done enough? I'll tell you what, if you have breath in your lungs, he's done enough. That breath is borrowed breath, and he deserves it back. And I feel like some people, you either feel like God has told you something and he's not fulfilling his promise. Reread these stories. What I just told you is in like 5 pages. But that was like 15, 16, 17 years that David waited for that promise to be fulfilled. Imagine how excited he was. And he would have put up with jeering from his brothers, from his dad maybe. And he's certainly tortured by his own king. But you can see God's purpose in hindsight. But some of you are waiting for that moment. You're waiting for the next season to worship God. Maybe you're waiting for God to call you or give you a promise. God might be waiting for you to get up, shake the dust off of whatever you just went through, and worship him just because of who he is. If David becomes king too soon, and I've given you some indications of what might be happening. Israel wasn't ready. David wasn't ready. We don't know. We're just inferring that from the text. But we know that God wanted him king at age 30. We know that now in hindsight. If it was before that time, it may not have gone so well. But David was one of the best kings that ever reigned. Israel saw some of the best days when David was king. But it might not have gone that well if it was too soon. A lot of people, Christians, we want the promise, but we don't want the process. We just want it now. And we're in the microwave generation, aren't we? Just give me that, put it in the microwave. I don't want to cook. You know, you get the homemade lasagna. I mean, Dave, the chef here, I mean, he does everything right from scratch. Nobody wants to do that anymore. You're crazy. I'm going to buy you a nice microwave lasagna. We want it now. And so we do that with God too. We want it now. But God is not a right now. He's not in the destination as much as he's in the journey. That's where he does the greatest stuff. When a baby comes out of a womb too soon, we call it premature. And the sooner it comes out before that due date, the more likely it is not to survive. And that's what some of you are waiting for. Do you know what? You'll be launched into whatever it is when it's God's timing. And not until then, and you don't want it until then, because you might not be ready. One other king, and I kind of stretch a little bit as a king, Abraham. He ended up being the father of Israel. So he didn't ever lead Israel, but I'm calling him a king for tonight because I'm up here preaching. I got the mic. And it just made for a better title instead of two kings and that guy. Abraham, when he received a promise from God. God said to, back when his name was Abram and his wife's name was Sarai, he came to them and said, you're going to have a family. A race is going to come out of you. A whole country is going to come out of you. And they're going to be as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Of course, we know in hindsight he was talking about Israel, which certainly happened. Abram didn't know any of that. Abram, who was later God named him Abraham and his wife from Sarai to Sarah, was 75 years old when he received that promise. He didn't know how it was going to happen. He and Sarah didn't have any children yet. So already that promise didn't look likely. But regardless, and his wife was 10 years younger, so he's 75, she's 65. And I think menopause is come and gone. But it says that Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. God just went, I'm going to overlook all the other stupid things that you do. You're 75 years old, and I told you that a race is going to come out of you, a country, a peoples is going to come out of you, and you believe me? That's all God's looking for, is that you believe him at his word. Well, Abraham and Sarah, as time goes on, they're now 75. Abraham turns 80, turns 83, turns 85, he turns 86. Sarah's now 76. This is not looking good, babe. Sarah says, here's my concubine Hagar. Why don't you sleep with her? And if she bears you a son, that'll be how God fulfills the promise. Okay, so they did that. Hagar ends up having Ishmael. Well, 13 years later, Sarah gets pregnant. Abraham is 100 years old. Sarah is 90. 25 years, folks, between the promise and it being fulfilled. The baby, Isaac, is born. What do we do with Ishmael? I don't know how that applies to your life, but some of you have Ishmaels in your life and you're going, finally, God does the promise. And what are you going to do with Ishmael? What are you going to do with what you did because you were tired of waiting for God to do what he was going to do? What do you do with Ishmael? Let me tell you, Ishmael ends up getting blessed by God. Sarah gets jealous and is worried that Ishmael is going to take the inheritance from her son Isaac. So she banishes Hagar and Ishmael, but God out in the wilderness has compassion on Hagar and ends up blessing her and blessing the son Ishmael. And the blessing was this: though he will be a wild donkey of a man and will have the sword at all sides with all the nations around him, I will bless him. Well, we know through history that is the Islamic race. And that's the only reason that they are a major religion that contends with Christianity, a major world religion. Same with Judaism. They just missed Jesus. They're still waiting for the Messiah. That's the difference between Christianity and Judaism. They're still waiting for Jesus, for the Messiah to show up. And so, as far as world religions, that's the reason that they're as big as they are, because they have God's blessing on them. Because we're live on the internet, I can keep on going deeper, but I don't want it to look like, I know, somebody's life doesn't matter. You know what I mean? But that is the history. If you talk to the Islamics, they say that they believe that Abraham is their father, but they believe that Ishmael was the legitimate son and Isaac was from the concubine. So history gets a little bit funny there. To this day, Israel, Isaac, and Ishmael are at war. When you step in front of the promise, God fulfilling the promise, and you try to help yourself, maybe you're waiting for a job, maybe you're waiting for a relationship, and God doesn't want you to stay single. God doesn't want you to stay unemployed. But all of a sudden you jump into that relationship, you jump into that job, you end up buying that house because you're tired of waiting for God to show you the right house. What are you going to do when He gives you the right one? Ooh, it just gets shivers down my spine. What are you going to do with your Ishmael? You're better just to wait on the Lord. Whether it's 15 years, whether it's 25 years. Now in these cases, Abraham, after he received the promise, ended up living another 75 years. We don't have that advantage. God knows you're not going to live to 175. So listen, He's going to be a little faster in fulfilling the promise than these numbers that I'm giving you. But Abraham's a great example of when you stop waiting for God and you take matters into your own hands. The third king is Joseph. He ends up becoming the vizier, or Pharaoh's second man in command in Egypt. Joseph has a dream. Has two dreams, actually. One was all of the stalks of wheat, and there just happened to be the same amount of his brothers, 11. And they were all bowing to the one stalk of wheat. And so Joseph, in all of his wisdom, lack of wisdom, goes and tells his brothers, "Hey, I got a dream to tell you." They hated him for it. They already hated him because their father loved him more because he had two wives, and Joseph was the firstborn of the wife that he loved more. Pretty messed up. So Joseph was 17 years old when he received that dream. The promise from God that he would be a great leader, that his family essentially would bow down to him. But Joseph had a problem. Pride. And I'm going to show you. So he has the one dream, and he tells the brothers that dream. Didn't go over well. Joseph, give your head a shake. He has another dream, and I believe this was God testing him. Are you going to keep your mouth shut this time? This dream is I'm telling you something I want to do for your future. Don't go and rub it in people's faces. Well, he has a dream about stars. And there were 13 stars. There were actually 11 stars bowing down to one star, and then there were two other constellations, which would be mom and dad now, bowing down to him. Well, that didn't go over well. The brothers had had enough. They end up conspiring to kill him. And Joseph didn't learn his lesson the first dream. He ends up telling him the second dream. And now that we take a step back, I can say this, knowing the whole story, God had to discipline him. So he gets thrown into the pit, sold as a slave to an Ishmaelite, by the way. I think there's some great irony there. And gets into Potiphar's house, who happened to be the head of the jail in Egypt. So Joseph is now in Egypt, sold as a slave. He works his way up and becomes the head servant to Potiphar. Well, we know how that story ends. Potiphar's wife takes a liking to this other strapping, handsome man. And we know the story mainly from, in fact, I'm going to turn to it, from the fact that she keeps on hitting on him, and he keeps avoiding her, and finally he's in a robe, and she says, she comes on to him, and he says, "No, how can I do such a thing against God and sin?" And he tries to run away. She grabs his robe. She's got the robe. He's running away. Got the picture? He's naked, running away. She starts yelling rape. Well, Potiphar didn't like that, believed her story because of the appearance, and he gets thrown into prison. What you need to hear, because it sounds so unfair, but what you need to hear before is what Joseph says to Potiphar's wife just before he says, "How can I do this evil thing?" But he refused. This is Genesis chapter 39, verse 8. But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. He's talking to the guy's wife. "No one is greater in this house than I am." Joseph had a problem. "My master has withheld nothing from me, except you, because you're his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against my God?" So he goes to the next phase of discipline, and he's in jail. He's in there for a while. He, in jail, to his credit, becomes the leader of the jail. It says the jailer was so impressed with Joseph, he let Joseph run the place. So these two new guys come in from Pharaoh's, two new inmates come in, the baker and the cupbearer, right from Pharaoh's throne room. The baker feeding him bread, the cupbearer handing him his cup. But Pharaoh got ticked off with them, threw them in jail. We don't know why. He got offended by them, is what the text says. So here they are in jail, and they wake up one morning, and Joseph says, "What's wrong with you guys? You're so downcast. We both had dreams." And Joseph goes, "Hey, I interpret dreams, just like that. Tell me your dreams." And so they tell him the dreams. The cupbearer was, in 3 days, the interpretation was, in 3 days, you're going to be back in Pharaoh's palace, handing him his drink again. And the baker goes, "He got a favorable interpretation. I'm going to tell him my dream." Joseph says, "Well, yours is in 3 days, Pharaoh's going to cut off your head and stick it on a pole." So imagine those 3 days for that guy. I was thinking of that when I was listening to the text. My goodness, he had some dreams after that. So anyway, all that comes to pass. But Joseph says to the cupbearer, "When you're back with Pharaoh, tell him about me." Okay. Cupbearer goes back, forgets about him for 2 years. God knew that he was still pulling something out of Joseph, still pulling a little bit of pride, still giving him a little bit of humility. When Pharaoh has a dream and turns the whole kingdom upside down, trying to find an interpretation, the cupbearer goes, "Oh, there's a guy in jail." And so anyway, they send for Joseph, and Pharaoh says, "I had a dream. Can you interpret it for me?" The first thing out of Joseph's mouth is, "I cannot do it, but God. Tell me your dream. I will go to him and ask for the interpretation." It's just completely different. I cannot do it, but God. Some of what God is so let's give you some numbers. He was 17 when he had the dream, or when he had the dreams, the promise from God. 17. He was 30 when he went into Pharaoh's court. 30. And some of what God is trying to do to you is get rid of some of those old habits, so that you're ready to get into the place that you need to be. Because we know later, and read the story, it goes on from Genesis 37 to 50. It's all about Joseph. That's how important this is to God. When Joseph's brothers end up coming to Egypt, they don't recognize Joseph. They're coming because there's a famine in the land. They come and Egypt has food thanks to Joseph interpreting the dream and knew that there was going to be a famine, so they stocked up. Now all of the countries are coming in, so Jacob sends his brothers to go get food. And Joseph's response to his brothers is absolutely beautiful. But if he hadn't gone through all that stuff before, would it have been that way? If he was second in command of the world's empire and his brothers that threw him in a pit show up? But it just shows that what God for 13 years was ripping out of him in a pit, in slavery, in jail. But Joseph never complained. He had pride, but he also had tenacity. And he just kept on going, and he kept on going, and he kept on going. He ended up passing away at age 110. So, yeah, he waited 13 years, but then he celebrated 80 years of great success. I know it seems like a long time that you've been waiting, that you've felt yourself in this pattern of, will this always be like this? But I want to give you some promises that I know. I don't know if God's promised you a house or a wife or a husband or children or grandchildren or whatever it is. I don't know what he's promised you. But I know in the Word, he's promised this. Don't worry about tomorrow. Don't worry about what you'll eat and what you'll wear. The unbelievers, they worry about that. Gets them nowhere. Don't worry. And I know for sure, he doesn't want you unemployed. He doesn't want you without something. I'm speaking to, you guys can be unemployed if you like. You worked hard, and I appreciate everything that you did to build up the system for us to enjoy. Again, I don't know what God has promised you, but I know he's promised you that he will never leave you or forsake you. He hasn't forgotten you. Oh, the enemy loves to come to you when you're lying in bed and say, he's forgotten you. You're believing in a lie. He doesn't remember. He's in the middle of a pandemic. There's 8 billion of you. He doesn't know you. Jesus said, I know you. My sheep know my voice. And I'll end off with this scripture, Philippians 1:14. Verse 6. This is one you might want to not just write down and on a piece of paper and put it on a magnet on your fridge. You might want to actually write it on your fridge. Just wait, it's a good one. Philippians 1 verse 6. Being confident of this, love that. Being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Jesus Christ. Being confident of this. He's working something out in you, or maybe around you with the people around you, or maybe the circumstances around you. Don't come out premature. Don't create an Ishmael. Being confident of this, he who began a good work will be faithful to complete it until he returns again.